Dee was one of the most caring and giving people you could ever imagine.
She was a good person. She was outgoing, she was spunky, to say the least.
She loved to be together.
She was a strong woman.
She protected everyone.
As far as the children, she couldn't be any better. And then when grandchildren came along, I mean, she just lit up like a star.
She was adamant that she was Nana and not a grandma.
I mean, this woman would step in front of a bullet for them in a heartbeat.
It was certainly tough for the family to face my sister's remains in a man-made tomb.
She didn't deserve this. And I know deep down in my heart that she wouldn't want her children to live in remorse and grieve the rest of their lives. She loved them too much.
The case is not closed, so there's more work to be done.
There's one person that could stop all this madness.
Your 11 Investigates team here with another episode of Case Files. Melissa Andrews along with lead investigator Brian Duggar. We're covering a big arrest this week in a sensational case in our area, the murder of Dee Warner. Just a couple of weeks ago, her stepson was charged in connection to her murder.
Yeah, Jaron Warner. And so on April 4th, we're going to have that preliminary examination up in Michigan. And Michigan does things a little bit different than Ohio. Like Ohio, when you have a felony case, typically the probable cause is shown at a grand jury. But in Michigan, it comes down to this preliminary exam. So we're going to see witnesses all day that will testify. The defense will have a chance to cross-examine them. And then the judge will ultimately have to decide, is there probable cause to go ahead?
We'll get our first look at some of the evidence against him. But what do you say, Brian, we take everybody back a little bit? And just if you're new to the Dee Warner case, this will give you kind of an idea and a timeline of what's all happened here in Lenawee County starting in 2021. Take a look.
Family and friends say they knew something was wrong when Dee didn't answer her phone or text messages.
This time was different. There's no doubt about that. The last time I ever saw her was Friday afternoon.
Her nephew, Parker Hardy, remembers thinking Dee wasn't herself in the days leading up to her disappearance.
I remember her getting out of the car. She was exhausted. She was babysitting my youngest cousin's youngest daughter. And I went to grab the baby for her, and she goes, "No, that's okay, honey, I got it." But normally our relationship is giving each other a hard time, joking, stuff like that. She was just head down, just different.
Was she defeated?
I think so.
People who knew Dee and people who didn't came together to search. They combed hundreds of acres over the next few days and weeks. Hardy says the case hit a brick wall until his mom, Dee's sister-in-law, was watching true crime TV.
That was a total mistake of my mom watching 48 Hours one night. And she grabbed my dad was asleep. She grabbed my dad the next morning and she said, "You got to watch this guy."
That guy was Billy Little Jr., a private investigator. Dee's family says he volunteered his time and promised to leave no stone unturned.
This case will go on until there's an arrest, until there's a conviction in this case, until there's a civil lawsuit for wrongful death. That we are not stopping.
He said, "I'm here to find Dee."
Pro bono.
Pro bono. And he said, if the case leads me to you guys, he said, it's going to lead me to you guys. I just want to warn you that. Yes, I'm sitting here in your facilities, but if you had anything to do with this, it's going to lead me to there. And we all said, go right on ahead.
Dee's family asked a judge to legally declare her dead in September of 2022. An attorney at that time for her husband, Dale Warner, said Dee had left before and may have just packed up for good this time.
There's easy ways to get identification from the internet,
from resources overseas. You can get identification. You can even get a different identity. It's possible today, I guess, to even get a new Social Security number.
With no one charged in Dee's disappearance by May of 2023, her family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Dale. He would be held in contempt of court in September when a judge ruled he ignored the court's order and sold off assets shared between him and his wife. Dale would be charged with murder and tampering with evidence in November of 2023.
We are back on the record in the state of Michigan versus Jaron Warner.
In June, a judge ruled he'd go to trial without Dee's body being found until August 18th, when police found remains in a tank on property Dale owned. Remains that would be identified as Dee's within 4 days.
All right, so there you saw a couple of the family members of Dee Warner talking with 11 Investigates. They've been very generous with their time over the years, always giving us their perspective on some of these issues that have popped up. Of course, when Dee was missing, they wanted to get the word out about that and keep people looking for her. And then most recently, with the word of Jaron's arrest, we spoke to them as well, and we'll be getting to some of that in a little bit. Let's go back to this preliminary hearing in Michigan, which is coming up on April 4th, 2025. In Michigan, as you touched on, we really get a sense of a lot more than we do in many other states, including Ohio. I mean, it's kind of a mini trial.
Yeah, so Ohio, yeah, you have the grand jury, which is secret. We never really know what happens at a grand jury. But in Michigan, this is an open court. And, you know, we know that he has been charged with tampering with evidence and being an accessory after the fact to a felony, but we don't really know what they have against him right now. But on April 4th, we're going to learn a lot of that.
And also at these preliminary hearings, we could see motions. Attorneys will argue if they want to exclude or suppress any evidence. There may be motions to dismiss. That's always kind of the first attempt at dismissing charges, usually by the defense. And then we could see some other motions come in, and maybe an attempt at even a plea deal in some cases. We also know that Dale Warner, Jaron's father, is the husband of Dee Warner, and he is sitting in the Lenawee County Jail right now awaiting his trial, which starts on September 2nd. So it was really interesting because at one point, at least overnight, these two men, father and son, were both in the same county jail related to this case.
Yeah, that is interesting. And you actually had an interesting story because when Jaron Warner was arrested, it was like at the very end of February, I believe like February 28th or something like that. And it took all of us by surprise. It was kind of over the weekend, and we knew that he was in jail and that he was going to be arraigned on that Monday. And you were actually up there for the Skelton brothers. Mm-hmm. And so then you found out, I mean, just talk about that a little bit, because you found out, like, we didn't know when the arraignment was going to be. We were thinking it was going to be in the afternoon, but it ended up being in the morning.
Well, first, his arrest came on a weekend. I was driving back from Cleveland. I had a funeral there, and I started receiving texts that there had been an arrest. So we worked on that pretty much all that night, and then the following morning, which was a Sunday. And then we're told that the arraignment would be at 1 p.m. on Monday. We knew we also had the Skelton brothers hearing, and there was a lot going on. We also had the Marcella Chedester trial going on in Monroe County. And so it wasn't until that morning, 8:30 a.m., I'm driving to the courthouse in Lenawee County and get a text that the arraignment is at 8:45. Usually they want you to file some sort of a paperwork. Some judges are particular about it, some are not, if you want to film anything. So I just went and sat in the courtroom, and I was going to run upstairs to Skelton minutes later, and I got yelled at, "What are you doing here without your paper?" So I just went outside in the hall and filmed some video and waited for everybody to get done and found out what happened. But we were the only ones in there, so.
Yeah, that was interesting to me because it almost seemed, I don't know that this was the case, but it almost seemed like they were trying to be a little secretive about
limit the
bringing
publicity.
him into court.
It could be. It was definitely took everyone by surprise. And like I said, we just happened to hear about it 15 minutes before, and that's why we were there. I wanted to let you know one of the things, we had talked to the family, Parker Hardy, Greg Hardy, which is Dee's brother. Greg Hardy, and his nephew is Parker Hardy. They've always been wonderful, really keeping this case in the news and in the forefront, which is how I think, and you could attest to, a lot of families, that's how they keep the pressure on, essentially, on law enforcement, which this family has certainly done. But I wanted to read his reaction to Jaron Warner being arrested, because at one point this was a family member of theirs. He said, this is Parker Hardy, Dee's nephew. Our reaction was certainly shocked. Our family always had suspicions of an accomplice, promised to bring justice for Dee, and we are going to make sure that everyone involved is accountable for taking her life.
Yeah, and we actually had sound of him talking to us,
We
right?
do. We have another soundbite here too, yeah.
Yeah, so as we got, when we were younger, we were somewhat close. They obviously married into the family when we were basically in middle school. And we were all close, we all hung out together like cousins would. But as we got older, we kind of grew apart, all of us. So that, his side of the family, we just weren't very close to towards the end. They just kind of had moved on with their own life, and we were really just closest to our actual blood relatives.
Yeah, so he's talking about the families growing apart there. And Dee and Dale, they each had previous marriages, and they had kids. And what I understand, the kids were actually close until Dee disappeared, right? Because then at that point, they were a little suspicious maybe of Jaron and Dale's side of the family.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the history of the two families as it's been described by Parker himself to us, the two families, kind of Hatfield and McCoy, they have a deep history of actually not getting along. The Hardy family, Dee's family, and the Warner family. They've been farming families up there for a generation or so. And so when they got married, that was a hard transition in itself. I think that they eventually came together for the kids, and everybody got along at a point, but you can see how easily a break was caused when something like this happens.
Now you mentioned the kids, and Dale and Dee actually had a young daughter.
She just turned 13.
She had just turned 13, and
Now she's 13, I should say.
Right, but Jaron was appointed
Power of attorney.
Power of attorney over.
By Dale.
And she had been living with Jaron at Dale and Dee's house, right? So this was actually another point of friction between the two sides of the family. I mean, I think Dee's family wanted her at one point, but Dale appointed, the power of attorney to Jaron. So right now.
He saw the writing on the wall, with what was going on with him legally, and so he made that preemptive move, yeah.
Yeah, so this young girl is kind of caught in the middle right now.
Yeah, it's really difficult, and we've seen this with other crimes where one parent is accused of murdering another. It puts the child, the minor child, in a very difficult situation because the adults have their own opinions based on evidence or things they've seen or heard, adult matters that kids may not be privy to, where they form these opinions. And usually if they want to keep that relationship with the child, they've got to keep those opinions outside of the conversation. So I do know that Jaron still does have custody. He is out on bond. It was a $125,000 bond. He still does have custody. I know that Dee's eldest daughter, she does have some visitation, Amber. But a court-appointed advocate during all of this custody stuff that's been going on, Amber's been trying to kind of get custody, has said it was in the best interest for the young girl to maintain relationships with the siblings. Sure. So obviously we hope everything works out there. They've admitted they've got a lot of court cases going on. They've got Dale's case, they've got a bankruptcy case within all of this, and then they've got the custody stuff still going on.
Oh.
So a lot happening up in the Lenawee County courts. We also talked with, the other person, Catherine Adams, has been instrumental in this. She's called herself a family spokesperson. We know that she's a dear family friend. And she's also helping to start up kind of a foundation in Dee's name to basically help smaller law enforcement agencies get help from, like your Michigan State Police, your FBI sooner. We also saw that in a recent case as well. Which one is it? I'm thinking, is it this one? I know that Tanya Skelton also mentioned to me that she would have liked to have law enforcement come in that case, more law enforcement at an earlier stage. So this woman's been very helpful. I talked with her outside of Jaron Warner's initial court hearing, and hear what Catherine had to say.
It's shocking, honestly. It's another step, I guess, towards getting justice and figuring out exactly what happened on April 21st of 2021.
You always felt that there was someone else involved. Did you expect it to be him?
Probably not. No, I don't think that I ever expected Jaron. He's very young. He actually is an extremely intelligent young man. He's always done really well in school. He's, held great jobs. So I would have thought that he'd be smarter than trying to get involved in something, that could potentially ruin the rest of his life.
So kudos to Melissa here, because again, we were surprised by this hearing, and we did not have a camera person with her at that point. So you used your iPhone or your cell phone to get this video. But so when we're talking about the family being surprised by Jaron, I mean, they suspected, I think early on, that Dale had to have an accomplice, that he couldn't have pulled this off by himself, but they were surprised it was Jaron. I mean, so can you just talk a little bit about why they thought he might have needed an accomplice?
Well, I don't think it was just him. My husband is from this area. He has family who farm in this area, and he deals with farmers in his job. And he told me, he keeps track of this stuff a little bit. And he said, everybody that I talked to said there's no way that he could have done this by himself. And when I went back to the family and said, hey, did you guys ever think this, that maybe there was someone else involved? They said, yeah. And I think it has to do with the alleged welding of the tank, maybe where Dee's body was during the searches and whether it was moved into that tank after initial searches of that area. And I think there's been kind of debate about his skill at welding. And so that's what I think it surrounds. And so when you say accessory after the fact, that means that they're not looking at Jaron Warner as being involved in the murder and accessory to murder. They're looking at him as being an accessory after the fact, after a felony, which is the murder. So then you start talking about, theoretically, did this person help get rid of a body? Did this person help conceal something? Did they tamper with evidence, help destroy something?
I think when you look at that charge under Michigan law, it basically says that the person knew that a felony had been committed, and either they concealed evidence or they helped a suspect in the case try to avoid arrest.
Now, when I had talked to some of the sources close to the family, I know that there was, Dee and Dale had a business together, a trucking business at one point, and there was some concern over whether, Dee had gotten into an argument with someone at the trucking business, and whether or not people within the trucking business could have been a part of an after-the-fact scenario. But so far, Jaron's the only one that's been charged with that. One thing that I wanted to talk with you about would be strategy here. So do you see, in all the cases that you've covered, and you specifically have an interest in plea deals, I know you're working on a big story right now about dark pleas, but in your experience, is the prosecution possibly using these charges as leverage to get at Dale Warner?
Yeah, when you were talking there, I was actually thinking this, that I wanted to ask you about this, because what we do see a lot of times, they will charge sometimes someone close to a suspect, holding that leverage over them. And, Jaron Warner, these are felonies that he's facing. I mean, he could go to prison if he's found convicted. If he's convicted for, several years, probably at least 10 years, if he's convicted. So you have his father sitting in prison. He's clearly the one that they really want because they believe that he killed Dee. Now, do they also really want Jaron? I don't know, but you could see them using Jaron and going to Dale and say, look, your son could go to jail for 10 years. Maybe you want to plead guilty to this. Or they say, Jaron, look, you could go to prison for 10 years. You really want to do that for your dad?
Two ways they could
Absolutely.
be playing it.
So they could appeal to him, that help us, and we can kind of make some of these charges go away, or go to Dale and say, work with us, and maybe your son won't have to go to prison.
And do we really even know, I mean, Dale Warner had a preliminary hearing too, but do we even know the breadth of the evidence against him, or is it your belief in these Michigan preliminary hearings that they introduced what they needed to get the case to trial, and then they save some for the actual trial?
Yeah, so he had his preliminary exam, and at that point, the prosecution just needs to show probable cause. Again, it's like a grand jury. And you think of a grand jury, I mean, they just hear evidence, and it's not nearly the total amount of evidence.
So they may not have put all their cards on the table.
Yeah, so they just need to show probable cause. So I think we'll see much more down the road.
We have, at the same time, we've not seen any indication from Dale and his team whatsoever that they would be even open to a plea agreement.
No, we haven't, and that's why I do think this April 4th hearing is going to be really interesting, because, you know, Dale might be sitting there and it's like, well, I don't even know what they have against Jaron. You know, maybe this is all a bluff, so maybe his team wants to hear what they have against Jaron. And you know, right now, we don't know what they have against Jaron, so we're going to learn a lot of that on April 4th.
At the very minimum, what do you think they'd have to have?
I mean, I think at the very minimum, they're going to have to be able to show that he knew that Dale had killed Dee. At that point, at the minimum, you have somebody with knowledge of a felony, and, you know, whether he was helping him dispose of, I don't know, clothing or tools that were used, or just trying to hide him out. I mean, anything like that, if they can show there was intent.
It will be very interesting, because then I start thinking, does this come down to phone records, text messages? Does it come to cell phone? Well, you know, he's living in the house where he lived, but I am just wondering what they could actually have to be able to prove this. And my first mind does go to cell phone. I mean, that'll tell you a lot, text messages.
I mean, it really does. I mean, we see that over and over in cases, how they're able to use cell phone records, and not just that, but tower data. Like, they know where your cell phone is because it's pinging off a specific tower. And I was just talking to somebody the other day, and, you know, they mentioned the Michigan State Police. They said they are sharp. You know, this is a retired detective I had talked to, and said they just have an outstanding crime lab up there, and they have really good investigators.
Anything that you're expecting to come out of this on the 4th in terms of any motions? Do you think they're going to file to dismiss right away? I mean, it seems like low-hanging fruit. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean,
they'll come up with some reason.
I think no matter what the prosecution says, I think the defense is going to say, look, Judge, they don't have enough evidence here. Clearly, they don't meet the standard that we need. So, yeah, I would expect to see that.
So Dale's trial starts September 2nd. It's expected to go for about 6 weeks till October 14th. So this is going to be one long trial. It's going to be a big trial, and I'm not really sure what evidence we all have here either. Like I said, I know he had a preliminary hearing, but I'm not an expert on what exactly was revealed during that, it doesn't seem like it was necessarily the breadth of what they have either.
Yeah, I think the big reason they're pointing to him, right, is that this was on his property. His missing wife shows up dead inside a sealed fertilizer tank that basically only he had access to. So I'm thinking, you know, why are they pointing at him? That's probably the big reason.
But, you know, a lot of it is circumstantial. The behavior that he exhibited, people felt like he wasn't participating in the searches. I think back to the 48 Hours special that we brought you here, and we had that interview with Aaron Moriarty, who was great on the case too, about him saying, oh yeah, she took her makeup or whatever, she must have taken off. He was just very quick to dismiss it as, you know, she took off. And I think a lot of times the behavior is what really makes you into a suspect initially, and then the police have to kind of find that evidence to prove whether it was you or whether they can clear you, which they want to do. Either one would be fine with the police, I think. Clear him or it's him, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, and you mentioned circumstantial evidence. Unfortunately, most cases, particularly murder cases, they are circumstantial. You know, I know we've done other cases where they have clear-cut DNA evidence that kind of points to a suspect, but that's not always the case. So
and his DNA could be all over that tank for any reason because the tank was his.
Absolutely.
And as well as anything in the home.
Absolutely. So it's going to be interesting to hear, you know, his defense, and it's going to be interesting to see the evidence that the prosecution has.
So that's coming up on September 2nd through October 14th, and of course our team will be all over that here at 11 Investigates.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us here on this latest episode of 11 Investigates Case Files. We will be following the court appearance of Jaron Warner coming up on April 4th. If you're watching this episode after that, you can find full coverage of that on WTOL.com and WTOL 11+. We'll see you next time.